will you host during your class on war? And I was like, yes, there's so many important issues to discuss about that. Her research and performance work examines critical refugee studies, political economy, forced migration, oral histories, inherited trauma, nation building in the United States and Vietnam. She has published a number of different places, including the Methuen Drama Anthology of Modern Asian Plays. She has over 15 years experience working in arts education, community development, and human rights in United States, Brazil, Philippines, Vietnam. So I think it's pretty cool. One of the things I asked her to do for you folks too is to kind of, maybe in the Q&A period or something, explain more about her background, because I really want to encourage you folks to travel and do all these great things as well. Without further ado, Patricia.
Thank you. So first off, it's an honor to be here with everyone during this critical week in our nation's history as we continue to fight for justice and reveal this nation's history of violence. So I wanted to thank Dr. Jean Wu for the invitation and Dr. Dorothy Roney for opening up your Asian American and War class for this talk. And also thank all of you for being here, and also Dr. Vo. Salt water. Vietnamese refugee passages, memory and statelessness at sea. This talk is dedicated to those who could not make it across the ocean, through the stories of those who were able to make it to shore, to urgently ask us to think critically about the role that memory and performance offers in current discussions of the refugee crisis. The inauguration of the incoming administration and their inheritance of deportation policies, plans to create a Muslim registry, and the continued production of refugees through the legacies of the Cold War, war on terror, / increased efforts to fight against the Islamic State in Syria and the Middle East. Refugee doors closed at Malaysia. We only had enough food for one day on the voyage, with no land in sight. For days we were at sea. The waves rocked the boat so much it made me sick. I remember being surrounded by water, but we couldn't drink any of it. I was so thirsty. Thai pirates came to steal with machetes in their hands. They took one of the women off my ship, and luckily didn't kill any of us. As my mother recounts her journey at sea, her voice is matter of fact. She sits quietly, looking into the distance, occasionally glancing at me with a smile and a shrug. She tells me she didn't think the story was important. It was what I just needed to do to survive. But she does tell me that she was lucky, that the Thai pirates are kind to her boat because she heard stories of far greater violence, of rape, of torture, of killing. For over 30 years, my mother remained silent about her boat exodus. Her story is an important one, not only because it allows me to understand what she endured on her journey to the United States, but also because it allows us to rethink the circumstances under which refugees seek asylum and the violence of statelessness at sea. The opening quote is an excerpt from my mother's narrative of her journey as a Vietnamese boat refugee in 1979. She was stranded at sea for 3 days. Others were stranded upwards of 2 weeks to a few months. When my mother's boat left the coast of Vietnam for Malaysia, Malaysia closed their borders and banned incoming refugees from reaching their shores. They weren't accepting any more people, my mother recounted. We were left to drift at sea for days, fearful for what was ahead. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR, the State of World's Refugees 2000 report says, Malaysia and Thailand frequently resorted to pushing boats back away from their coastlines. When Vietnamese boat arrivals escalated dramatically in 1979 with more than 54,000 arrivals in June alone, boat pushbacks became routine and thousands of Vietnamese may have perished at sea as a result. Closed borders and pushbacks meant refugees were vulnerable to the violent conditions at sea. The end of the Vietnam-American War led to one of the largest exoduses of the latter part of the 20th century. More than 3 million people escaped from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos for over 2 decades, starting in 1975. Many by boat. During the post-war period, Vietnam faced extreme poverty, large-scale unemployment, a limited food supply, and rampant corruption. 1 to 2 million military and civilian personnel who were associated with the former Republic of Vietnam and the United States were persecuted as war criminals and imprisoned in re-education camps. Moreover, an estimated 400,000 to 1 million people were forcibly removed to new economic zones. Ethnic Chinese or Hua people were also strategically pushed out of the country through the government's unofficial support of clandestine boat departures. In this talk, I focus on water, not only as a site of possibility for freedom, but also death. I argue that performance opens up a space to theorize across borders and time to meditate on water as fundamental to the story of Vietnamese refugee passages and subject formation. The oral histories from my parents and boat people, and the Boat People SOS media archive of boat rescues, of escaping the sea, evoke themes of danger and loss, deeply informing salt water, a performance piece I developed and performed as a daughter of refugees, in which immersion of my body in salt water conjures a meditation on the material conditions of dispossession at sea. Salt Water was performed for the 40th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam-American War in April 2015, in conjunction with the Association for Asian American Studies Conference on the Transnational Imaginary, Global Cities, and Racial Borderlands. Salt water neither seeks to confer a wholeness to the refugee nor to recuperate a fragmentation of subjectivity and home on the course of exile and exodus. To create this performance and to theorize Vietnamese refugee subject formation, this performance takes up what critical refugee scholar Fiona Ngo describes as, quote, an ethical stance that refuses to cover over the violence that brought us to the present moment, wherein failure need not be overcome, rehabilitation need not be desired, subjectivity need not be recovered. It is at this point of refusing catharsis through the overcoming, rehabilitation, or recovery of subjectivity that saltwater positions itself to theorize subject formation through memories evoked by water. Saltwater uses salt and water as the core materials to conjure memory and embody properties of the sea that are critical to the performance, symbolically representing the contents of the ocean and the tears and the sweat of the people who traversed it. The space is set. There is a steel metal bucket filled halfway with water in the middle of the stage. There are 2 spotlights set on the bucket that cast shadows along the floor and the wall, representing the haunting presence of those who have disappeared and died along the passage. I began my performance dragging a 40-pound bag of granulated salt crystals. My body is pulled between the tension of the bag and my movement forward. The heaviness of the bag evokes the burden and labor of remembering. I drag the bag across the space, leaving traces of salt behind me to create a ritualized space of witnessing. Performance is used here to cross geographic, temporal, and political borders in 2 main ways. First, to embody memory work as both gendered labor and a tool of resistance against historical amnesia and the aftermath of war and the violence of forced migration. And second, to center the materiality of water and the body as sites of dispossession and possibility at sea, which marks racialized, gendered, and class alterity. Water takes a central role in its presence and absence. It sits in the middle of the bucket. It sits in the bucket in the middle of the stage, still and calm, until my body glides into the gentle ripples of the water, 1/3 of the way into the performance. In its absence, water lays metaphorically within the ritualized circle created with traces of salt, and the labor of memory performed by dragging the 40-pound bag of salt across the room. The traces of salt carve a place of witnessing outside the circle and the ocean inside. Oversaturated by discarded bodies, undrinkable water, and the excess of lives left adrift at sea. Here, the focus is on the body immersed in salt and water, neither moving forward nor returning back. The demarcation of water both inside and outside of the bucket encircled by salt creates a snapshot of suspended time and space, which puts into question the temporality and the cartography of freedom in the movement across the ocean for refugees. The salt scattered on the concrete evokes images of discarded bodies, those who were left to die and disappear at sea. The overwhelming amount of salt outside and inside the bucket revealed the undrinkability of the water. The excess of my body as a performer in a smaller bucket, rocking back and forth and back and forth and back and forth within the performance space is a performance gesture and movement drawn directly from the narratives of my mother and my father as they describe the motion of their bodies in relationship to the boat voyage, and the visual images of bodies stacked on top of one another, bodies scrambling to jump from boat to boat, and bodies left floating on the water, captured in the videos of Boat People SOS. Why does water serve as both metaphor and material through which to consider Vietnamese refugee subject formation at sea? It is at the site of the ocean, a space between nation states, that we find the intersection of claims to the sea as economic capital and routes for natural resources, trade, travel, and expansion for competing sovereignties, functioning both as a stateless place where refugee bodies are left to drift at sea, and an extraterritorial space where the UNHCR and the United Nations Convention on the Sea, on the Law of the Seas, govern legal agreements between nation states. Water is a critical site of analysis for refugee passages. Water and refugees do not fit into the logics of the nation state. The world is made up of 71% of water, and the majority are contested by nation states competing for natural resources and claims to trade routes. Refugees call into question systems of citizenship, rights, recognition, and visibility, especially those at sea, caught in the largest space between national borders. Water and salt water represents a critical geopolitical site and scene of dispossession for refugees, already marked as outside of the boundaries of the nation state. Water is also a fundamental metaphor for Vietnamese subjectivity. The Vietnamese word for water, nước, also means homeland, country, and nation. In Live by Water, Die for Water, Vietnamese scholar Nguyen poetically portrays nước and its deeply material and metaphoric connection to Vietnamese people. Nước has come to designate the homeland, the country, the nation. Water as the most precious resource of the homeland for growing crops, in particular rice, has come to stand for the homeland itself. The nation's fateful course, marked by ups and downs, is figuratively rendered as a tide of water, but nước, with its ebb and flow. The highest virtue demanded of a Vietnamese is that he or she love the nước, you nước. The worst opprobrium that can attach to any individual is that he or she has sold out the nước, bán nước. To say in Vietnamese that a man has lost his country is not the same as to say in Vietnamese that he has lost the nuc, muk, nuc. If the English phrase sounds almost abstract, the Vietnamese expression evokes an ordeal by thirst, the despair of fish out of water. Phrases such as tide of water, bak nước, love the water, yêu nước, and sold out the nước, or sold out the water, bang nước, relate to a sense of self deeply connected to water, to one's relationship to the homeland. The phrase muk nước, or to lose the country and water, as represented by thirst of fish out of water, reflects how critical the concept of nước is to Vietnamese subjectivity. The phrase not only represents a metaphor for a lost country, but also an embodied response to being physically removed from the place of sustenance. Thus, removal from water, evoking metaphors of loss, deprivation, or separation, is equated with displacement from one's homeland or the very source of life. What happens when there is excess, an overflow of water that surrounds the body of a Vietnamese subject forced to migrate by boat? Excess or overflow is at the crux of the oral histories of Vietnamese boat refugees, wherein the possibilities of life and death at sea are overdetermined by an excess of water. In my father's narrative, for example, he recalls, "There was a typhoon. Our boat rocked so intensely you could hear the ricketiness of the wooden panels on the boat creaking as it rocked back and forth with water banging against all sides of the boat. It was terrifying. We didn't know if the boat would just crack open and drown all of us." His words reveal the power of water not only to capsize, but literally rip apart a small cargo ship and drown everyone on board. The strength of water to carry refugees across the ocean is matched by the dangerous conditions by sea. Depending on the size and type of the boat, they were typically packed with up to a few thousand people. The boat was not only brimming with the overflow of water, but the overflow of bodies packed on top of one another. My father recounts his memories of being underneath the small cargo ship. We laid next to each other, hundreds of people underneath the boat, right next to each other. The boat's movement in the ocean, gliding up and down and up and down, made so many people sick. You could see people vomiting right next to you. The smell was so foul, but we got used to it after days. We only came out at night when the moon disappeared, or else the Vietnamese Coast Guards would catch us and could kill us at any moment. During this period, the UNHCR estimated that around 10% of the boat people were lost at sea, fell victims to pirate attacks, drowned, or died of dehydration. Mapping temporalities, so cartographies of the gift of freedom. Freedom or death was the ethos of the boat people as articulated by Boat People SOS in their accounts, often framed the Vietnamese refugee passage across water, with promises of reunification belied by poverty and political persecution behind them. What lay ahead for Vietnamese boat refugees was the choice between freedom and death. Displacement for Vietnamese boat refugees marks a historically specific shift in the meaning of water for Vietnamese. Although thirst is encapsulated in Nguyen's imagery of the despair of fish out of water, an excess of water marks the Vietnamese boat refugee exodus. The body is overwhelmingly consumed by undrinkable water. The story of migration over water for Vietnamese boat refugees has been narrated through the frame of escape and rescue. Escape from the terrors of communism, escape to freedom. To map the narrative of escape and rescue is then to situate them within what critical refugee scholar Patricia Nguyen theorizes as the gift of freedom, which was bestowed by the U.S. first through its liberal war and then through refugee humanitarian attention and action. For Nguyen, quote, "Liberalism is wrought through temporal concepts of historicism and teleology that comprehend history as the actualization of an ideal presence, which here goes by the name of human freedom. that presumes to knowingly realize and manufacture this present and presence through the gift of freedom as its rational dissemination across the globe for human progress and historical and political transformation, end quote. As a result of the aftermath of the war in Vietnam, in order to continue the narrative of gifting freedom to the Vietnamese people, the site of freedom was reoriented from war to escape from the homeland, in what the UNHCR has declared as a, quote, commitment of Western states to resettle refugees fleeing communism, end quote. This movement across the ocean not only symbolized a pathway towards freedom, but necessitated a narrative of arrested development mapped on the body of the refugee. The refugee is therefore suspended in space and time, a figure of humanity on the outside, only to be rescued by the gift of freedom. In salt water, the performance of halted refugee passages poses questions about the gift of freedom and the power structures of competing and overlapping sovereignties that play out not only on the ocean, but on the body of the refugee. So this photo here is actually a map created by Patricia Nguyen, a Vietnamese boat refugee. This map was found here at the Southeast Asian Archive and was used by artist Chin Mai in her work entitled The Stars Will Tell Us for the Vietnamese-focused Generations of Stories exhibition that took place. Jun's map was the only thing that he was able to keep as Thai pirates confiscated all his navigation equipment after having been raided 4 times. And this map was his way to navigate across the Gulf of Thailand and embodies the capture of how Vietnamese refugees were caught at sea and how we can rethink how freedom is mapped. The will of survival on the part of refugees and the pre-mapped conditions created by war, humanitarian aid, and contesting nation states.
Patricia, do you mind pointing out some of the routes? I think some folks in back might be a little faint, if you don't mind.
This was a scanned copy that I got from the library, so it's not actually that clear to me either, like where it's at. But I think that's kind of, because Jin Mai actually has a better version of this scan on her website. But I wanted to use this scan from the library because it is that murkiness that kind of allows, that embodies what, like the complications of what it means to think about like refugee passages across this unknown territory and space as like different entities are competing against and on each other. So I actually am not sure where the pathways are, but I did that purposely. So, on drifting at sea, performing saltwater. Performance allows for the redrawing of boundaries and configuration of bodies to trouble, disrupt, and intervene in hegemonic discourses, constructing and reframing Vietnamese refugees. The sensationalization of Vietnamese refugees at sea frames the water as a space of migration and extreme vulnerability, but neglects an analysis of the very presence of water itself as a very geopolitical material that creates the conditions in which refugees become a managed population outside of the boundaries of the nation state. In this remapping, water becomes evocative of the memories and oral histories which theorize refugee subject formation. My body, both as a performer and as a daughter of Vietnamese refugees, traverse across, between, and through performative geographic and historical borders of these memories to stage a call for justice for those caught in the violence of statelessness at sea. What do we do with these memories? How do we make sense of the stories and the historical trauma of forced migration and statelessness at sea? Performance art allows me to center the body in the act of embodied listening to oral histories because, as Diana Taylor, a performance studies scholar, writes, it is impossible to think about cultural memory and identity as disembodied. Water offers material to work through the felt sensing embodiment of the oral histories gathered to reveal the visceral paradox of dispossession from water as nook and homeland while being surrounded by an excess of water. Water as a fluid, liquid, and translucent property capable of dissolving particles and seeping into cracks while having the potential to destroy whole communities, induces critical bodily sensations. In addition, water's everyday uses as a source of nourishment for the body in agriculture, rituals of cleansing, and its ability to drown or poison when taken in excess makes it a crucial site for evoking memory on and through the body of the oral history narrator and performer. I hold onto my body tightly until I clutch the side of the bucket and violently rock it, shaking it, feeling the cold metal against my wet hands as my overflowing body pushes against the bucket, water splashing onto the concrete around me. In this moment, I do not know if the bucket will fall over and my body will smash onto and against the soaked, hard concrete. I began to drown myself in the water, submerging my head in the bucket, inhaling and swallowing gulps of salt water, lifting my head up as I gasped for air and then dunking my head into the water while my lungs fill with a burning sensation. It is as though my insides are going to rupture from the pangs of salty water ingested. Gasping for air, every crevice of my body is burning from the irritation of salt. My lungs inhaling the salty residue of water dripping from my forehead onto my face, into my mouth. The performance of drifting, juxtaposed with the violent imagery of capsizing, drowning, and the toxic, undrinkable water, performs precariousness at the crux of statelessness at sea. The effects of salt water on the body can lead to severe dehydration, blood in the stool, vomiting, loss of appetite, and unconsciousness. I simulate drowning to conjure memories of and the affect of the threat of being thrown overboard, pirate attacks, countries finding refuge, and dangerous tidal waves. As Jinmin Ha writes in Grandma's story, quote, "Stories are transmitted from mouth to ear, body to body, hand to hand. In the process of storytelling, speaking and listening refer to realities that do not involve just the imagination. The speech is seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched. The salt water burning inside my chest and scraping against my skin, the murkiness of the water and the smell of sweat from the labor of performing violence to conjure memories of dispossession at sea. Drifting as a performative gesture necessitates the imagery of a vast ocean of water to call upon a memory recorded and unrecorded, in the spoken and unspoken, in the felt and sensed narratives of Vietnamese boat refugees. After intensely gasping for air and recovering from submerging my head underwater, I shift to stillness. I look into the blinding spotlight positioned in front, doing nothing else but looking ahead, waiting, 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 until the lights go out. The performance ends with no closure, no finality, only an intensity built up to a painful silence of drifting. It is adrift on the boat where refugees with bodies stacked on top of one another are caught on the brink of drowning and floating across the ocean. The concept of drifting demands of us to refocus our attention to the lives at stake in policy debates of resettlement, deportation, and granting asylum. The act of witnessing through performance entails reckoning, as Rivka Eisner writes, entails reckoning with the impossibility of ever fully recognizing the extent of others' absences and losses. However, it is still critical to witness the impossible to witness, to reckon with what you realize you do not fully comprehend, recognizing at best that one can never encompass the extent of even one person's loss. Salt water does not seek to capture the entirety of a Vietnamese refugee experience at sea, Rather, the performance gestures to the very violence of waiting and dispossession of people at the forefront of refugee crises. Here I conclude. Water becomes a site of sensationalizing refugee exodus. The images that capture our popular imagination in the US and global media at large include Elian Gonzalez floating on a raft from Cuba, a young Syrian boy whose lifeless body is captured on the banks of Greece, and boats filled with refugees fleeing North Africa capsizing in the Mediterranean Sea. These images, each with their own racial and gender dynamics of individual and collective bodies, create a shift in understanding the sea as a place where refugees have escaped extreme political danger to the dangers of the sea itself. The sea has been a recurring scene upon which the precariousness of refugees is sensationalized, a site that is distinct from borders on land. The ocean is rendered as a place between nations, and the fate of the refugee is both configured by the extraterritorial policies of the UNHCR and enforced when nation-states are willing to grant asylum. Water as both site and material of the sea thus offers a theoretically and methodologically layered and elusive framework to discuss Vietnamese subjectivity and subjection at sea. Focusing on water in this contemporary moment is critical as increased security at land-based borders force waves of refugees to escape by sea. For many Syrian refugees, barbed wire fences in Greece, Bulgaria, Austria, Hungary increase the risk of fleeing as they continue to search for alternative routes. The UNHCR has reported that in 2015, over 1 million refugees arrived on the coast of Europe by boat. Moreover, that same year, thousands of Rohingya refugees from Burma were left to drift for months in the Andaman Sea. Because the mechanisms for search and rescue missions in Southeast Asia do not exist as they do under the same Triton program or under the Triton program in Europe. Meditating on water elicits discussions of the material and political economic conditions refugees face, unfolding the sea as both a site of possibility for freedom and an in-between space where refugee lives are marked as already disposable. Salt water, the performance, humbly offers another avenue of possibility through performance, as a call for justice in the uneasiness and the violence evoked in the act of refusing catharsis, of refusing closure, that the fight for the livelihood of people forced to migrate from their homes and left to die crossing borders, both land and sea, is not erased and forgotten, and the struggle for memory continues. I end with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. as we begin this week commemorating his birthday and his life's work in civil rights and social justice. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle